Hey, True Advocates, back with another episode. This one's a little bit different, though. It's going to be a recording of my conversation at the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival. Listen, if you didn't get a chance to make it to Austin, next year it's going to be in Denver, and you are not going to want to miss it. You get to hear firsthand from family advocates, meet your favorite creators, and just have a good time in general. So I highly encourage you to attend. Again, this conversation is one talk that I gave about turning my tragedy into purpose. It's called Resilient. I speak from the heart here. I am not scripted at all, but it was something that I felt was really an important message to share. So I hope that you get something out of it. Also, you're going to hear about a nonprofit that I recently started called Angels Voices Silenced No More in this episode. There's more information in the show notes below, but essentially Angels Voices Silenced No More is a nonprofit that raises and grants funds to families who are fighting for justice. And I'm super excited about this because it's going to change what it means to fight for justice in New Mexico. New Mexico is already a very poor state. There are a lot of challenges with navigating the justice system. So we're going to try to help families in New Mexico by offering them money for funeral expenses, for therapy. We want to pay for things like billboards, flyer printing. We want to pay for private investigators or attorney fees or court fees, anything that might help a family in New Mexico who is fighting for justice. So if you want to get involved, you can email us at info@angelsvoicesnm.org. And you can find the links for all the ways to donate in the show notes below. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your desire to advocate for justice for families in New Mexico. If you don't know me, I'm Eric Carter-Landin. I'm the host and producer of True Consequences podcast. I'm the co-host of Crime Lines and Consequences and the co-ghost of Dos Pequeños, which is my fun show. If you are into paranormal, I was a believer in paranormal, but as I've started doing this show and started researching any paranormal phenomenon, I've become more of a skeptic now. I recommend you check that out if you like silly times. I did not prepare an actual script today. I'm just going to talk from the heart because I feel like that's going to be the best way for me to deliver this message, because I think that this is something that is so personal to me and something that is coming from my heart anyway. I know some people in here may know me and my story. Is there anybody who doesn't know my story? Okay, you don't know my story, you know, okay. So for those of you who have heard the story, I'm sorry, I'm going to go through it a little bit here. But before I do, I want to start with kind of the theme of why I wanted to have this talk. So when I was about 11, after I had lived through the most horrible experience of my life, my grandmother pulled me aside one day and she said, "Eric, you have a choice. You can decide to let what happened to you consume you. You can let it overcome you. You can become the very thing that you despise. Or you can make another choice. You can choose to go a different way." And I wasn't really aware of how profound that was at the time because I was so young. But that interaction that I had with my grandmother set me on a path which has led me here. So I'm going to go a little bit back and talk about what happened. I'm not going to go into full detail. If you want the full story, you can listen to season 2 of my podcast. You can also listen to a bunch of other podcasts that have covered Jacob's story. This is my baby brother, Jacob. He died in 1987. He was murdered by my mom's boyfriend. It was child abuse. He was 9 months old. And a lot of other things happened. This man was a narcissist. He was extremely abusive. He was physically, sexually, and emotionally abusive to me. He was physically and emotionally abusive to my mother. And he was also friends with the police. They played basketball every weekend. In 1986, 1987, there really wasn't a lot of information available about domestic violence, about child abuse. There was stranger danger. They talked about that a lot. But nobody was talking about the fact that the majority of abuse that happens is from somebody you know. My mom was very young. Jacob was having some injuries, and the doctors really didn't raise any red flags. And there was one point where Jacob had a skull fracture, and I was blamed for it. My stepdad told everybody that I was jealous of Jacob and that I kicked him in the head so hard that his skull fractured. I was 6. I probably weighed maybe 40 pounds if I was lucky. So I just don't see how that's likely. But because there were no red flags raised by the doctors, there was a Child Protective Services investigation. But when they came to our house, my stepdad chased the woman away, and that was the end of it. So I was sent to live with my dad in California, and my mom didn't think that I was responsible for what happened to Jacob, but she wanted to get me out of the situation. At the same time, she stopped allowing, and I'm not naming him, you may have noticed that already. I'm not naming him because in New Mexico there are things that could set the clock in motion for speedy trial, and naming him in the public could be seen as potentially problematic and could lead to a problem with the trial. My mom's really started reducing the amount of time that he was allowed to be alone with Jacob, almost to non-existent. But the injuries, anytime that he was with Jacob, continued to happen. Weird things happened. Jacob's personality changed. He used to be very excited to do crazy things. One of his favorite things to do was to sit in his baby swing, and when the swing would go forward, he would grab the legs, and as it went backwards, he would throw the entire swing backwards. And the first time it happened, my whole family freaked out. We're like, oh my God, are you okay? What's going on? So we actually had to start putting the baby swing against the wall. But Jacob's behavior changed. One day my grandmother picks Jacob up and puts him over her head, which is something that he used to love. And he starts screaming and crying and grabbing her hair, and he's shaking and he's freaking out. And my grandmother asked my mom, is something happening? Why is Jacob acting like this? So my mom confronts her boyfriend, and she says, are you hurting Jacob? What are you doing? And he says, no, I'm not doing anything. And he grabs Jacob and he picks him up. And Jacob is trying to jump out of his arms into my mom's arms. And he's crying frantically. And so my mom says, don't ever play with Jacob like that again. On April 9th, 1987, my mom's working. My grandmother has Jacob. Jacob's been sick because he's still recovering from the skull fracture. He had an allergy to the medication that they had put him on, and he also had an ear infection. So he was fussy. My grandmother wanted to go to church, so she calls my mom and says, what do I do with Jacob? He's really fussy. I don't want to bring him to church because I don't want him to disturb everybody. My mom says, I guess you can take him to my boyfriend. I'll be off in an hour. In less than an hour, Jacob was being rushed in an ambulance to the hospital with a hematoma, a re-injured skull fracture, a broken rib, as well as signs of abuse on his body. The injuries were so severe that in my small town, he wasn't able to be treated. So he was airlifted to Albuquerque, which is 75 miles away, and he was rushed into emergency surgery. My mom and my grandparents and my mom's boyfriend took the long way. They drove, and when they got to Albuquerque, Jacob was already in surgery. His injuries were so severe that the doctor had to sign off on the surgery without my mom's permission. And in the late hours of April 10th, Jacob passed away. He didn't survive the surgery. I'm giving you all of this because it goes back to what my grandma told me. So I go through this, my family goes through this horrible loss of Jacob, and also all of the abuse that I endured and the abuse that my mom endured. And I got into a dark place. I didn't want to live anymore. And my grandma pulled me aside and told me that. And I'm so grateful for that. Because in my mind, I was thinking about giving up in that very moment on everything. 11 years old. That moment changed the trajectory of my life. And I decided that was going to end with me. Never again in my family will something like this happen, as long as I'm around. But I also found that I wanted to do more. And as I grew up in New Mexico, I started to see cases coming through the court system, cases you may be familiar with. Victoria Martins, Omari Varela, baby Brianna. So many child abuse cases in New Mexico. Baby Brianna, I think, was only 2 or 3 months old when she was abused and eventually succumbed to her injuries. Her mom is free right now. She was involved. And as I'm watching these cases go through the New Mexico court system, I kept saying to myself, somebody needs to say something. Somebody needs to do something. Because New Mexico has always failed at protecting children. Jacob, 1987, for me, that's where it starts. But I'm sure it started way before that. It just starts there for me because that's my earliest memory. But as I grew up, it didn't stop. And it's still not stopping. A couple of years ago, James Dunkley Cruz, 6 years old, obvious signs of abuse, reported to Child Protective Services, murdered by his stepfather. New Mexico has a policy of reuniting at any cost. Family reunification is the most important thing. Not child safety, not protecting a kid from being abused. The goal is to reunite that kid with his family no matter what. So just think about that for a second and the implications that has for somebody. For a kid who is told, if something is happening to you, tell an adult. Tell somebody. They tell somebody, and nothing happens. As this continues, and I'm having this thought in my head, somebody needs to say something, somebody needs to do something, I finally decided that I would say something. That I would do something. And again, I leaned on that advice from my grandmother. You have a choice. You can let this consume you. You can become the very thing that you fear the most, or you can make a different choice, go a different way. So I poured all of that anxiety, all of that energy, all of that sadness, all of that pain into trying to help. And I created True Consequences with the express goal of helping families like my family who felt alone, felt ignored, trying to convince a district attorney to press charges against the only person in the room when Jacob was injured, and being told no. Because your mom is just vindictive, because she's trying to make problems for her poor husband, who is an upstanding member of the community, who's friends with the cops, who works for the county. And my family and I start feeling like maybe we're making too much of this. Why is nobody else angry? Why does nobody else care? And I never wanted another family to feel like that in New Mexico again. So I opened my show up to talk to family members, to give them a platform to tell their story, to give them the opportunity to share it in their words without being edited for context. I will take out the awkward pauses. I do take out the ums and the stumbles, but for the most part, it's their message. It's their story to tell. It's not my story to tell. I have the platform. I'm fortunate enough that people actually listen. And so I turn that tragedy into momentum, into purpose, into helping people in my community. And it hasn't been easy. It's been a difficult journey, but I'm so happy to say that my son never has to worry if he's going to be murdered in his sleep. Never has to worry if his mom, my ex now, is ever going to be killed while he's sleeping. He gets to grow up in a house full of love and peace. And that's the best gift that I can give to him. The cycle stops right here. It's not going to continue. I know that probably somebody hurt my stepdad. It doesn't excuse his behavior, but I'm like 99% sure that somebody hurt him. And again, he had that choice. It consumed him. He became what he was. My son never has to make that choice. And that's a huge blessing. And as I continue to help families through the show, I've also started to explore other opportunities to make a bigger impact. Last week, I just received a letter from the IRS that my new nonprofit, Angels Voices, Silence No More, has been approved as a nonprofit. And so the vision and the mission really are to raise money so that we can grant to family members in New Mexico who are fighting for justice. And those funds are going to go towards paying for funeral expenses, paying for therapy, paying for a private investigator, DNA testing, advertising on social media, billboards, whatever they need in their fight for justice, that's what we're going to be doing. And so the reason I'm telling you all of this, I don't want you to feel bad for me and or anything like that, but if you've ever had any kind of tragedy in your life, and sometimes it feels impossible, just remember the words that my grandmother told me. You have a choice. You can let it consume you. You can let it destroy you if you want, or you can go a different way. It's up to you. That was way shorter than it was supposed to be. This is what happens all the time when I don't write a script. But I wanted it to be heartfelt and I wanted it to be genuine. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or have any further discussion. Absolutely. Okay, so there's a lot of things here that I have to unpack. And I actually have learned some things recently that nobody else knows. So you guys are going to hear this before anybody else. Although Whitney and Melissa already know. Charlie knows. Kristen knows. Yeah. Okay, for the longest, you probably don't know yet. It wasn't something I put in the group text. We'll just say that. It was something we talked about in Albuquerque. I always suspected that there was a cover-up. I couldn't prove it. I knew that he was friends with the police. I knew that they played basketball every weekend. I knew that he worked for the county and that he had keys to every county building, including the DA's office. I always had this gut feeling, but I could never prove it. So I never said it because I don't like claiming things without having proof to back it up. So recently I started working with a retired detective out of New Mexico who just so happens to know all of the police that were initially investigating the case. And she's reinvestigating it for me. I did get the case reopened by the Attorney General, but they're not moving on it. I brought her in. Her goal is to go in there, put a full case file together, and then turn it over to the Attorney General, and hopefully that will inspire them to press charges. But in this investigation that she's doing, she found out through one of the investigators that the case was covered up. He flat out told her. There was a moment where the state police were trying to investigate this person, and the sheriff of Socorro County in New Mexico took the suspect in his vehicle and drove around for hours and hours so that nobody would find him. There is a confession that is mentioned in the police report that we have no record of. There is no recording. There is no report. It doesn't exist according to the police department. I don't know where it went. They don't know where it went. All we have is a little note in the case file that says the suspect no longer needs a polygraph because he confessed. That's it. I don't know what he said. I don't know if he was intimidated into giving a confession. I don't know anything. I just know that allegedly he confessed. That's one of the goals of this detective. She's trying to see if she can find something. I don't have a lot of hope because it's been 36 years. I have hope that we can get this case across the finish line, but I don't have hope that we're going to find this confession, if that makes sense. Yes. No. Is this gentleman Jacob's father? No. I didn't go through all of that because, and I probably should have, because then we would have been on time here. But no. So my parents, let me just back up a little bit. So this guy and my dad were best friends. And for context, this person was not a stranger. My whole family knew this person. My mom not only went to school with him, but went to church with him. His aunt is my godmother. His sister married my mom's brother. Our families are very connected. And from the outside, he seems like a great guy. He's happy, he's outgoing, he's generous, he's friendly, he makes good jokes. Everybody loves him. But when you get him behind closed doors, he becomes a completely different person. To the point where I couldn't even look at him without being accused of giving him dirty looks as a 7-year-old. And then my mom would inevitably defend me, and then he would beat her up for it. They were best friends. My parents were going through a hard time. My dad was a Pentecostal evangelist, and he basically would abandon us for weeks and weeks at a time. There would be no money in the house. My mom had 2 young kids. She couldn't work. And so there were times where we didn't know when we were going to eat. Then my dad had an emotional affair with a woman, and that was the last straw for my mom. The best friend, knowing all of this, because he's talking to my dad, swoops in to save the day and starts showering us with love and gifts and attention and affection and all the stuff that we were starved for from my dad. And he's a good guy. We've known him our whole lives. He's part of the family. Made sense. So he manipulated his way into the situation, taking advantage of my mom when she was at her most vulnerable and preying on that vulnerability in order to get what he wanted. He was extremely jealous of Jacob. He said I was. And I probably was a little jealous of Jacob as a kid, but it happens. But he was extremely jealous. Any attention my mom gave Jacob usually resulted in her getting screamed at. He would play his radio really loud when Jacob was asleep. My mom would turn it down and he would start screaming at her. There were a lot of signs, but again, there wasn't a lot of knowledge at the time. Not Jacob's dad. Long answer, short question. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. He's still alive. I hope he's suffering. Yeah, he's still alive. And for me, what does justice look like? It's a really hard question. I think the main thing for me and my mom is we want our day in court. Jacob deserves that. But more than that, I don't want him to be able to hurt anybody else ever again. And he's had 36 years to do just that. I want him locked up, not out of vindication, not out of anything else other than I don't want him to hurt anybody else. That's it. Yeah. That's a really good question. Yeah. Unbelievably, there is no record. Again, just to reiterate, he was friends with all the police. It was shocking to hear that because I did expect that there would be some sort of record or at least something. Yes, he has since remarried. They did have kids. She also had kids prior to them getting together. I don't know a lot about what happened in that relationship or what's happening in that relationship because I obviously don't want to be connected to this person at all. He's been blocked on social media, so he can't see me. I didn't block him from the podcast because I hope he sees that. But yeah, he doesn't have anything on record, but I don't think that means that he didn't do anything either. Bob? No. Yeah. Yeah. This is where people get really mad at my mom. And I understand that perspective because I think people like to think that in that situation they wouldn't do what my mom did. But you really don't know that. Because when you're in that type of relationship, the goal of that person, once they've hooked you with the love and the affection and the love bombing and all of that, is to break you down as small as you can be and to isolate you from everybody who supports you so that you have nowhere to go. So I just want to put that out there. If you've never looked into what domestic violence looks like, I highly encourage you to, especially if you're having that feeling of, I can't believe this happened when I tell you what happened. So just keep that in mind, please. So after Jacob died, John, I'm just going to call him John, tells my mom that he wants to talk to her. And the only place that he wants to talk to her is at Jacob's grave. This is a week after we buried him. My mom thankfully did not go. But he kept telling her, I'm going to tell you what really happened. I'm going to tell you what really happened. So then, eventually he was given a polygraph. And this gets a little bit confusing, but there were 2 agencies investigating the case. The New Mexico State Police, because when Jacob died, he died in Albuquerque, not in Socorro, where the abuse happened. And then the Socorro County Sheriff, as well as the Socorro Police, were investigating it locally. So while the police report says he confessed and there's no need for a polygraph, that was from the city. The state, however, decided that there was a need for a polygraph. And so they gave him one. And he told my mom, I'm going to prove to you that I didn't do this on purpose. I want you to come with me to this polygraph exam so I can show you that I'm innocent. And we went to Santa Fe. It's about 2 hours from where we lived. We had to wait outside. He went inside. It took a long time. I think it took 4 hours. Could have just felt like that because I was little, but it felt like forever. And then he walked out, happy as can be. And my mom said, how did it go? And he said, I passed. It went great. So in that moment, we all were like, he obviously is telling the truth. Obviously it was an accident, because if it wasn't, if he failed this polygraph, not knowing the law, not knowing things like that when I was that age, but surely they would have arrested him and charged him. So we believed him. Then he did this thing where he said, oh, by the way, I signed you and Eric up for my health insurance at work, and I said, you're my wife, and so you have to marry me or I'm going to prison. And so my mom married him. Again, if you're having that thought, please educate yourself on domestic violence and what happens with the psychology of it. And that's when he became extremely violent towards her and extremely abusive towards me once she was locked in the marriage. And then at that point, when she's almost been murdered herself, she realizes that this is not the same person she thought he was. And at first, she didn't think he was capable of killing Jacob. He had 2 kids, they seemed perfectly healthy. She knew him her whole life. But after that, she did now believe that he was fully capable of killing Jacob intentionally. So she divorced him after a number of things happened, but the crux of it was when my cousin was being targeted by him and he was grooming her for sexual abuse. She was 13. And my mom found out about it because my cousin, thankfully, has a loud mouth and doesn't care, and told everybody. She was like, oh yeah, no, I'm not telling anybody. Great. Hey, grandma. She saved us. She got us out of that situation, because I think my mom, not knowing what was happening to me because I didn't tell her, because he told me if I said anything, he would kill both of us and nobody would ever find us. So I didn't. But my cousin did. And that gave my mom the inspiration and the motivation and the fire that she needed to get out of that situation. And that's when she went to the DA and said, please, you need to press charges against this man. And that's when they said, you're just a scorned woman, get out of here. 1991. Any other questions? Also, if you have mean things to say about my mom, please don't say them to me, because I'm very protective of her. What's that? Oh, just keep it to yourself if you feel that way. For my sake. Any other questions? No? I want to thank you for listening. I know this is not an easy conversation to have, but I appreciate the fact that you're here because these conversations need to happen. It is so important. Just for the sake of an experiment before we wrap up, could I ask you all to close your eyes, okay? And you don't have to look around. I'm going to do this and then I'll tell you what happens. So raise your hand if you've ever experienced some sort of domestic violence. Raise your hand if you know somebody who has, and keep your hands up. You can put your hands down. 99% of the room raised their hand. Almost everybody has been touched or closely touched by this. But we don't talk about it. It is way more common than we think. And the only way that this can get better is if we talk about it. Talk to our kids. Tell them what the signs are. Tell them what to look out for. And then tell them you're there for them no matter what. We have to talk about this. We have to face this as a society. This is a huge systemic problem across the board. It doesn't matter if you're rich, if you're poor, if you're gay, if you're straight, none of that matters. Almost everybody at this conference has been touched by this. We can't ignore it away. Thank you.
Okay, you just heard me at the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival in Austin talking about resiliency and how I've turned my tragedy into purpose. I hope that was inspiring for you, and no matter what you have going on in your life, I hope that you're able to find some purpose in this moment, and I hope that you find some peace. All right, thanks for listening. Stay safe, New Mexico.